The next speaker will be Richard Nash from IMR in Bergen, Norway, and he will be talking about stock reproductive potential, of course, and the title of his talk is Would the Real Stock Reproductive Potential Please Stand Up to Be Identified?
Okay, so the title of my talk is Would the Real Stock Reproductive Potential Please Stand Up? May seem a bit of a strange title, but I came in at this from working in recruitment studies and undertaking various odd estimates of egg production and then survival all the way through to recruitment. And so I was quite used to using what I would call the reproductive potential of the population or the stock conversion into eggs and so on. And so I was quite glibly carrying on with this, and then discovered that a lot of people were using specifically TEP, or total egg productions, as stock reproductive potential. And that sent me scurrying back to figure out what exactly were we talking about. So if we go back to the original, say, definition or where it was put out, this was something that Ed described. And what I've done here is just highlighted what I think are the important words. First of all, compared to spawning stock biomass. So it's a replacement for spawning stock biomass. We're talking about population fecundities. We're talking about viable egg and larvae. And it is important, we're talking about viable eggs and larvae, which may eventually recruit to the adult population. So there we have a linkage back into recruitment. And I'll come back to that a bit later. And then one interesting thing is that at the end, there's this concept may evolve. And the question is, has it evolved? So if we go back to, again, the table which appears in that same publication, the interesting thing here is that the table also includes males, and that's something that we don't see very often in stock reproductive potential questions or estimates. There is also the viability question, which is raised in here in relation to egg sizes, larval activity, and so on, but a lot of that is not covered very often. And then there is the interesting part at the bottom down here, which actually has the linkage between maternal and paternal effects. So again, stock reproductive potential potentially is more than just the egg productions from the females. And then this is just to illustrate the standard outputs. We do this for all sorts of different stocks, and Northeast Arctic cod, for instance, SSB versus total egg production. Then you convert using the total egg production instead of SSBs, and then coming up with a stock recruit relationship, which is egg production versus recruitment. Now, the question really is, I've put in here total potential egg production, because the thing is, it's not really stock reproductive potential, because we haven't really addressed the question of viability and so on. So there are a lot of other things that really need to be added in here as well if we're going to replace this with, say, SRP. Now, within this talk, what I'm going to do is basically, it's a huge subject actually, and it frightened me once I got halfway into it. The two aspects I'm going to explore here are structural aspects with respect to the estimation of SRP, stock reproductive potential, in the form of viable egg production, and then some other factors that maybe we should consider with respect to stock reproductive potential or the reproductive potential of a stock. There are quite a few of these, and the ones in black are covered by many of you giving talks. I'm not going to actually say very much about many of these. So there are still potential problems with actual fecundities, temporal differences and downregulation questions, timing of estimation. So getting at the actual egg production, or the actual fecundities. We still have potential problems relating to maturity ogives. Again, temporal. This is a problem relating to getting the information from the field. Egg production still estimating relating to determinate versus indeterminate spawners and so on. There's also a new question mark being raised in relation to substock dynamics or subpopulations. So there is a spatial aspect which is now beginning to become more prevalent in relation to estimating total egg productions. And then again, there's this question of skip spawning, which is, whilst we know how many fish are mature, how many are actually participating in spawning. The last one I put in here is the use of VPA assessments, and it's been mentioned already, this question of natural mortality. Natural mortality, as we know, is very often not known. I'm just going to illustrate here some of the potential questions or problems that may occur. This is just Northeast Arctic cod, 1 year picked, take away the fishing mortality and assuming 0.2 as a natural mortality. So these are the egg productions across length classes for the standard form. We can play games with this till the cows come home. I've just chosen a number of different examples. The green one primarily is where we could suggest, say, for instance, there is a senescent mortality. The mortality is actually higher in the adults. Or the other situation where the mortality, purple and the blue, where the mortality is higher in juveniles and less in adults. And again, you can see that the production curve changes. Now, the thing is, if we're going to go to viable egg production, then it means that the numbers of eggs coming from different size classes is different. Therefore, their survival rate is potentially different. And again, you can see there are differences in the overall total egg production. And this is starting from exactly the same number of individuals from the beginning. And again, we could use another scenario, which is where you have high mortalities in the younger stages and also senescent death and so on, or stresses later on. So again, we don't really know exactly how to partition this egg production across the population. And and just by doing this, you can get up to 60% variation in egg numbers. We talked about viable egg production, or there's a question of egg quality. We still have a serious problem relating to egg quality. This is very often dealt with first time versus repeat spawners, for instance, and just removing parts. But the question is, how do we really deal with that question? An influence of males, for instance, as well. Not all eggs will develop in exactly the same way. Some males are better than others, and so on. So again, there's an influence in there with respect to viable egg production. Spawning time and duration. This again is something that needs to be considered because you've got match-mismatch questions in here. Spawning too early, spawning too late. If the environment is changing, then there are questions related to what would be viable. A good egg may be put into the wrong environment. And the last one I'm bringing up here is spawning location. Because again, if you spawn in the wrong place, the egg may be a good quality, but it's not viable. And this little illustration here is some work which was done on place, for instance. All the red areas are areas where eggs, if eggs are spawned in these areas, they would have a very high probability of getting into a nursery ground, and so potentially will survive. On the right-hand side here is actual egg distributions, spawning distributions of place. There's not a total match with these at all. So again, there are eggs which are being put out there which essentially are not really viable. And this is stretching the viability question just a little bit further. Then there's a question of trying to utilize both the males and the female information. And this is just from some work that we did with Northeast Arctic cod. And I'm just going to illustrate the point here. We're not sure how to deal with this. First of all, we have total egg production versus the viable sperm production, for instance. Okay, there are different dynamics between the males and the females. We could look at, say, for instance, the egg production being modified by fertilization rates due to, say, the sex ratios. Or we could go one step further and look at, say, for instance, the fertilization rates related to the condition of the males. And again, that changes that egg production from a standard TEP possibly into something which is viable, i.e. fertilized eggs. But again, how do we deal with this? But this is inputting, say, for instance, the paternal aspect in with the maternal. So briefly, how does SRP fit in with ecology? I mentioned that I was coming at this from recruitment, then again, there's the ecological aspect as well. Reproductive strategies is one question, and another one I'll look at is spawning ground dynamics. Again, I'll do this very, very briefly. Reproductive guilds. Again, this is a simple classification from Ballon many years ago now. What most of us are talking about are the top two, or the top one, non-guarders of eggs and young. There are dynamics associated with that group, which is what most of us are talking about. However, there's a whole set of other species which have behaviors related to spawning and parental care and so on. Guarders, bearers, and so on. Now, some people have said to me, well, why do you worry about some of these others? Some of them are actually commercially exploited as well, so we do have to take care or think about how we deal with these groups of species. Another comment was made to me actually by my co-author, Olaf, when he saw this. He said, why have you got so many pictures up there, especially on the right-hand side? I said, well, the point is really that there are a huge number of other species out there. Okay, so again, if we want to make this SRP a little more all-encompassing, then we do have to think about that as well. So just a few aspects relating to ecology and so on. Factors associated with sex ratio. I'm just picking this one out. There's a whole, I could have chosen all sorts of other aspects. Life history strategies. Okay, hermaphrodites. Okay, there's a problem or a question relating there with respect to sex ratios, especially when you have, say, for instance, sequential hermaphrodites. Live births, again, this whole question of females carrying one, two, or a small number of individuals, then it's not necessarily egg production per se, which is important. Spatial aspects in potentially relating to, say, for instance, males, because then the males take on a much more important role, say, for instance, with nest guarding, building nests, or even in the case of like pipefish and so on, where they're carrying the juveniles, the young around. Burrow constructions as well, spatial dynamics. So again, we're beginning to think more about spatial dynamics, which is something which has not been done so much. And again, harems, lekking, and so on. Again, other behavioral aspects relating to the reproductive potential of a stock. So, helping the stock reproductive potential to evolve. Well, the first thing that I think that I would like to see is that we sort of think more about offspring, which become more all-encompassing with respect to other lifestyles or reproductive strategies. So it's not just eggs and larvae. It doesn't stop people from estimating TEPs or so on, but again, what is the stock reproductive potential? Talking about egg production for a live bearer may be not quite relevant. And then this question of addressing this question of recruitment. To a certain extent, as a recruitment biologist or an ecologist, I would like us to try and get away from that a little bit and not tie this SRP too tightly to SRP. The reason, of course, is this. I mean, this is standard. We're talking essentially about this piece on the left-hand side, and it varies whether, you're talking about high fecundity or low fecundity populations and so on. There's a huge reduction in numbers of individuals down to spawning. And I'm putting this up very briefly. What we're talking about to a certain extent is the two right-hand quadrants here. There's an awful lot which goes on the left-hand side as well, if we take it up to recruitment. I feel comfortable talking about stock reproductive potential up to, say, for instance, here, but once we start going too far round through the early life history dynamics, then I start to get a little uncomfortable. So basically, in conclusion, I asked the question, or I said at the beginning with the title, would the real stock reproductive potential stand up to be identified? I would like to think that SRP represents the annual ability of a population to produce viable offspring, and these offspring provide the pool from which recruitment to the adult stock can be drawn. Because, again, we know time and time again, working with nursery ground dynamics, it's not always the same part of the egg production which gets onto the nursery grounds. It's not always the early, middle, or late part. So there are all sorts of other dynamics involved in here as well. So I would like to think that SRP would incorporate all processes up to when the adults cease to influence or directly influence the offspring. Okay, and in case of, say, for instance, parental garters, brooders, and so on, that would be the end of that stage as far as the egg production is concerned, etc. It does not mean that we don't quantify, say, for instance, the viability, because we're talking about the pool of individuals which can then go on and survive. And at that point, I'll shut up.
Okay. Thanks very much, Richard. We got time